Today, we're going to talk about an extremely important topic that's central to our daily life, and that's motivation. We're going to talk about pleasure and reward. What underlies our sense of pleasure or reward? We're going to talk about motivation and desire and craving, but also how dopamine relates to satisfaction and our feelings of well-being. As well, we're going to talk about the neurochemistry of drive and mindset. Motivation is fundamental to our daily life. It's what allows us to get out of bed in the morning. It's what allows us to pursue long-term goals or short-term goals. Dopamine is responsible for our sense of motivation and for movement. Whether or not we move, whether or not we want to move, whether or not we have the desire to overcome barriers of, they could be social barriers or financial barriers or time constraints. That depends on this molecule we call dopamine. And the way that motivation works generally in the non-addictive setting is that when you anticipate something, a little bit of dopamine is released. And then when you reach that thing, you engage in that thing, the amount of dopamine goes up even further. Understanding the way the dopamine system works will allow you to leverage it to your benefit. And if you don't understand the way that dopamine works, there's a good chance that it's going to pull you out into the current of life, meaning the rest of the world is going to control your dopamine schedules. You've got a structure in the deep part of your brain called the VTA. It stands for ventral tegmental area. The VTA, or ventral tegmental area, contains neurons that send what we call axons, little wires that spit out dopamine at a different structure called the nucleus accumbens. And those two structures, VTA and nucleus accumbens, you can think of them like an accelerator. They bias you for action. Motivation is a two-part process, which is about balancing pleasure and pain. But when you're just sitting around, not doing much of anything, maybe you wake up in bed in the morning, you're thinking about getting up or not, this reward pathway is releasing dopamine at a rate of about 3 or 4 times per second. It's kind of firing at a low level. If suddenly you get excited about something, you anticipate something, then the rate of firing, the rate of activity in this reward pathway suddenly increases to like 30 or 40 times. And it has the effect of creating a sense of action or desire to move in the direction of the thing that you're craving. Dopamine is released in response to sex. It's released in response to food. It's released in response to a lot of things, but it's mostly released in anticipation and craving for a particular thing. Let's say you're craving chocolate or a good meal, steak if you like steak, or a nice plate of pasta if you like pasta. When you eat that food, the amount of dopamine that's released in this reward pathway goes up about 50% above baseline. Sex does release dopamine, and it increases dopamine levels about 100%, so basically doubles them. Nicotine would increase the amount of dopamine in your brain very quickly, within seconds. That's 150 times over baseline, as opposed to sex, which is 100% above, or food, which is 50%. Just thinking about food, about sex, about nicotine, if you like nicotine, or cocaine or amphetamine, can increase the amount of dopamine that's released to the same degree as actually consuming the drug. Brain circuitry like this didn't evolve to get you addicted. Brain circuitry like this evolved in order to motivate behaviors toward particular goals. Water when you're thirsty, sex in order to reproduce. Let's say you love running or you love chocolate. As you eat a piece of chocolate, believe it or not, it tastes good, and then there's a shift away from activation of dopamine. For every bit of dopamine that's released, there's another circuit in the brain that creates, you can think of it as kind of like a downward deflection in pleasure. Try it. The next time you eat something really delicious, you'll take a bite, it tastes delicious, and part of the experience is to want more of that thing. This is true for any pleasureful experience. With each subsequent time that you encounter that thing, that you pursue the chocolate, that you pursue the lover, each time the experience of dopamine release and pleasure is diminished a little bit. And this is best observed in the context of drug-seeking behavior. The first time someone decides to take cocaine or amphetamine, they will experience a huge dopamine release and they will feel likely very good. However, the next time they take it, it won't feel quite as good. But the amount of pain, the amount of craving that they experience for the drug will increase over time. So much of our pursuit of pleasure is simply to reduce the pain of craving. If there's something you really enjoy, Part of that enjoyment is about the anticipation and wanting of more of that thing. Engaging in some way with some person that we really, really enjoy. But if we continue to engage in that behavior over and over again, it kind of loses its edge. It starts to kind of feel less exciting to us. And if we continue to indulge in the same behaviors or even different behaviors that increase our dopamine in these big peaks over and over and over again, we won't experience the same level of joy from those behaviors or from anything at all. Dopamine isn't as much about pleasure as much as it is about motivation and desire to pursue more in order to reduce the amount of pain. And we are now talking about pain. So your desire for something is proportional to how pleasureful it is to indulge in that thing, but also how much pain you experience when you don't have it. I'll use the example that I sometimes... use on here, which is my love of croissants. I love them. A really good one makes me want to eat 6. I taste it and it tastes so delicious. And unless I really force myself to experience the taste of it in my mouth and how flaky, I'm getting hungry for it right now, and delicious the croissant is, mostly the taste of that croissant makes me want to eat more croissants. Fortunately, most people do not experience or pursue enormous increases in dopamine leading to these severe drops in baseline. Many people do, however, and that's what we call addiction. First of all, I always say addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. So oftentimes what will happen is the person only has excitement and can achieve dopamine release to the same extent doing that behavior and not other behaviors. And eventually what typically happens is they will stop getting dopamine release from that activity as well. And then they drop into a pretty serious depression. It might make sense why this person, after several years of work hard, play hard, would say, yeah, I'm feeling kind of burnt out. I'm just not feeling like I have the same energy that I did a few years ago. And what's happening is they're spiking their dopamine through so many different activities throughout the week that their baseline is progressively dropping. So it starts to look a lot like the more severe addictions or the more acute addictions to things like cocaine and amphetamine, which lead to the... these big increases, these big spikes in dopamine, and then these very severe drops in the baseline. The key thing is to understand this relationship between the peaks and the baseline and to understand how they influence one another. Because once you do that, you can start to make really good choices in the short run and in the long run to maintain your level of dopamine baseline. Healthy, high level of dopamine baseline are what drove the evolution of our species, and they're really what drive the evolution of anyone's life progression too. So they're a good thing. Dopamine is a good thing. School, sport, relationship, etc., where you experience a win, you should be very careful about allowing yourself to experience huge peaks in dopamine, all these things to try and achieve that dopamine release. And by getting a big peak in dopamine, you're actually increasing the number of conditions required to achieve pleasure from that activity again. Understand that your ability to experience motivation and pleasure for what comes next is dictated by how much motivation and pleasure and dopamine you experienced prior. Start paying attention to the amount of dopamine and excitement and pleasure that you achieve with those, and start modulating that somewhat at random. That might be removing some of the dopamine releasing chemicals that you might take prior. I know this is a hard one for many people, but I do invite you to try removing multiple sources of dopamine release, or what used to be multiple sources of dopamine release, from activities that you want to continue to enjoy or that you want to enjoy more. Now, I caution people against using stimulants every time they study, or every time they work out, or every time that they do anything that they would like to continue to enjoy and be motivated at. They do cause the release of dopamine to a substantial degree. And over time, that will deplete your dopamine.